We will zoom in on the missions in the DRC, Mali and Somalia. What are the strategic achievements of these missions? What are the strategic constraints? Indeed, to what extent are they effective and do they have impact? My name is Annika Hilding Norberg and I'm the cluster leader for peace operations and peace building here at the GCSP. We at the GCSP are immensely delighted to be co-hosting this event in cooperation with NUPI, Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, and its senior researcher with the Peace and Conflict Research Group, Dr Cedric de Coning. NUPI and Cedric are the lead of this uniquely interesting and relevant global research effort and project. And he will tell us all about it in just a short while. However, from my perspective, I can only say that meeting here today, and especially the launch of this network and the work of this network, is indeed a logical development of the pioneering work of NUPI, together with colleagues around the world, that we just spoke about it just now, about the civilian capacity network that then led to the peace network, which engaged many of the emerging countries. And of course, you were heavily engaged in the HIPPO report development and consultations. And now it's kind of brought us here to this project that was launched a year ago by NUPI in the lead, and with researchers from really literally across the globe and all perspectives and dimensions to it. It's a global research network spanning civilian, military and police operations. So it is before handing over to Cedric, it is also my great privilege to introduce our other distinguished speakers on the panel this afternoon. I think you should have their full bios in the folders on your seats. As you know, we have a dream team panel here today. I will, in the interest of time, I will only mention the current occupation and also their role in this project. So I will start with Dr. Alexandra Novosseloff, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the International Peace Institute in New York. And she's also a permanent consultant on multilateralism at the Center for Analysis, Forecasting and Strategy of the French Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs. Alexandra is the lead researcher in the team looking at the DRC case. Also, we then have Dr. Linda Darkwa, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Lijn Center for International Affairs and Diplomacy. Linda is a key contributor to the case study on Somalia, and she's based in Addis Ababa, also working for the Training for Peace program with NUPI. And then we have Dr. Jair van der Lijn, who is a senior researcher and the director of the SIPRI Peace Operations program. And Jair is lead researcher on the case study on Mali. And finally, we have Dr. Fifi Edu Aful, who is currently doctoral fellow here at the GCSP and a research fellow and the deputy program head of the Peace Report operations at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. And Fifi is contributing to the case study and field research on Mali. And I'm on the International Advisory Board of the project effort. But these are the people doing all the work, of course. So the purpose of this panel, and welcome General, we're having a former very senior representative from DPKO here, and a fellow of the GCSP, of course. Thank you. The purpose of this panel and what we hope to achieve by this engagement with you this afternoon is to present preliminary findings of the project so far. Hear your feedback, your comments and input, which will feed into the process as the finalization of these 3 case studies are coming to a conclusion. And the results of the case study will be presented in early December in New York and then later in Addis Ababa. So we thought that having this first across the case studies consultation of the project here in Geneva, with the Geneva-based peace-building community during the Geneva Peace Week would be particularly useful to enrich the conversations here, but equally to contribute to the further development of the research findings and then ultimately its impact. Regarding the methodology of the program or workshop, we are immensely delighted about the strong interest in joining this group. So we're currently in theater seater, but we will break up for working groups, and you will have to join one of the case studies, and then we come back in plenary to continue the conversation, addressing synergies and looking at commonalities and differences across the cases. Before we start, let me just mention that we, as also noted in the email sent out to you, we will make an audio and video recording of the session. There will be no streaming, but we will seek to capture what is discussed and use the material for background material and follow-up productions. So we will essentially proceed with 1 hour in plenary with introduction of the project by Cedric, then discussing the methodology, the dimensions that it's working according to, and a short brief presentation of the 3 cases by the panelists. After that, we will go to the working groups, and you will join one of the 3 to go in more depth to discuss that particular case study, and then we will reconvene and discuss and share both the conversations but also the synergies between the 3. So, also, if you have any practical issues, Radostina and Federico are supporting us this afternoon, so please contact them if there's anything you need. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to hand over to Cedric, who will first share the overall background, rationale, and methodology of the project. Cedric.
Thank you so much, Annika, and delighted to be here with all of you at the Geneva Peace Week. Thank you so much for joining our session. Excited to share with you the research that we have started with this project. So essentially, we decided to create this effectiveness of peace operations research network about a year and a half ago. And it comes out of, as Annika mentioned, previous research networks that we had. We established a group around the Civilian Capacity Initiative of the United Nations. And then later we had something called the Peace Capacities Network that essentially involved research institutions from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So kind of a BRICS or emerging powers group. And that group looked at peace operations and security sector reform and civilian capacity. But then we decided to enlarge it to a more global network, which is the one that we are sharing with you here. And it came very much out of, as Annika mentioned, an engagement that we had together with the other colleagues in support of the high-level panel on peace operations. And as part of the work of the high-level panel on peace operations, they asked us to help them to organize 2 success factors workshops. And those workshops were meant to look at, different peace operations and what are the key success factors that lead, or what are the factors that lead to success in peace operations. And having done that, we realized that there isn't really a substantive, systematic body of evidence that helps us to better understand whether particular missions have been effective or not, or what would determine what effectiveness means in these operations. So that has resulted in us, deciding to, maybe we should try and focus on this, partly so that the next time, maybe 15 years from now, there's another Brahimi panel or a HIPPO panel, we have something at that point that we can actually look at more systematically than we did in the past. So that was part of the motivation behind it. But we realized very much that this is not something that one institution can do, or even that a small number of institutions can do. It's something that, if it's credible, it needs to involve all the major research institutions or think tanks from all the major stakeholders in peace operations, meaning the major troop contributing countries, or countries that contribute money, or countries that are hosting peace operations, or countries that are in some or other way involved as stakeholders in the peace operation process. And so that's why we set out to establish a network that has a very strong global north and global south presence or participation, and that is really focused on also when we undertake our studies, for each particular study, to put together a team that has strong global north and global south participation, that has a good gender parity, that has strong local participation in the team. And so we had all these parameters that we set for ourselves when we set out to establish this network. Also, to undertake this work would take quite a bit of money, and we realized it's going to be very difficult to go to any funder and with this kind of idea and to get sufficient money to undertake this project. So we set off with a kind of a self-funding model. So the intention is that most of the partners, all the partners who can, should fund their own research. They should fund their own people that participate in the research. We thought that was a bit of a tall order, but we were really pleasantly surprised to see the kind of interest we've had. So we've had, at this stage, I would say more than 50 institutions worldwide that are part of this network in one or other way. We have more particularly had about 20 institutions this year that participated in the actual research studies that we've undertaken so far. So we've undertaken studies into the UN mission in the Congo, the UN mission in Mali, and the African Union mission in Somalia as a kind of our 3 pilot studies, as kind of kicking off and testing our methodology and our approach. And you're going to hear about those 3 studies in a moment. But then also we had a further opportunity that we didn't initially foresee with some research funding that some of our partners had available. And so we've also now embarking on a 4th study this year to look at the UN mission in South Sudan. That will happen in early December. So we'll have 4 studies in this first year of undertaking this network. Maybe a little bit about the methodology. So having so many different institutions involved in jointly and collaboratively undertaking this research, we had to agree or find some common approach. So we embarked on a process to develop a shared methodology. The idea is, first of all, that all of us undertaking this research look more or less at the same things, so that when you put teams together that undertake a particular mission, they have a common understanding and a common approach. But also our idea is to generate these reports on specific missions over time, so that perhaps, 10 years from now, we may have 50 or 60 reports in a data set. And obviously then also the degree to which those reports are comparable or have some way of looking at things in more or less the same way will greatly contribute to being able to do comparative research among those studies and so forth. So that was the idea behind a kind of a shared methodology. And maybe 2 things to mention about the methodology at the outset, and then we can discuss it further. The one is that we realized as we were all starting to work on this, and many of the colleagues in the larger team have done research on this. Jair has done his PhD on this topic, and many other colleagues have worked on the issues around effectiveness and evaluation and measurement of performance of peace operations in their earlier work. And when we put our heads together, we of course understood that there's no one single way in which to define the effectiveness of peace operations. You can look at the mandate of an operation and measure a mission against its mandate, but as we know, those mandates are written in very broad diplomatic terms as a kind of a compromise between the Security Council members. It doesn't always tell you exactly about what the mission is doing, or even maybe is a good enough yardstick on its own about whether a mission has achieved its objective or not. There are so many other possible ways in which to answer that question or to look at that question. And so one of the ways, or what we decided to do, is to essentially look at the effect that peace operations are having through the lens of all the main stakeholder communities that have a stake in a specific peace operation. So we're interested, of course, in how the UN Security Council or the UN Secretariat or specific troop contributing countries understand whether a particular mission they undertook has been effective or not. But we're also very interested in how the host nation or the people of that country, and of course that is a very broad category with many different elements in that grouping, neighbors, regional organizations, partners, all of these stakeholders have views about whether a particular mission has been effective or not, and the degree to which we can capture those views and reflect on them to understand why a particular mission may be perceived or not, or be judged to be effective or not, is what we set out to do. And the other thing that I could mention is that we decided on looking at 8 specific dimensions for across the different cases. And these dimensions draw to a large degree on the recommendations of the high-level panel on peace operations, but also our other larger body of research that I'm sure you'll find them very familiar. These are dimensions like the political primacy, protection and stabilization, national and local ownership, regional and international support, coherence and partnerships, legitimacy, impartiality and credibility, women, peace and security, and the degree to which a mission is people-centered. So these were kind of the 8 dimensions that we chose to look at across the different dimensions and to compare our studies with each other. We can go into these 8 dimensions in a little bit more detail if there's interest. But I think this is the way that we set ourselves up in terms of undertaking our study. Maybe the one thing more that I should say is that what we thought would be a useful added value of the work that this particular network is doing, and taking into account that the UN is undertaking its own strategic reviews of its peacekeeping operations, and that different people are doing research, into protection of civilians or into women, peace and security in particular missions in much greater detail than we will be able to do. What we thought would be useful in these studies is to especially focus on the strategic level impact of these operations. How would a particular peace operation or conflict situation or peace process look like if this particular peace operations was not there? What is the essential difference to the situation that this peace operation has brought about? Why is it that the Security Council or troop contributing countries or other key stakeholders want a particular mission to continue, even although in our popular understanding it doesn't seem that a particular mission is having a great effect? You can think of a mission in Darfur, for instance. Right? Why is it that this mission is deemed necessary to continue? What is the value that people see, whether it's the Security Council or others, in this mission that necessitates or that results in the mission continuing? This is certainly one thing that we wanted to try and capture, because we realize that a lot of the work that is being done on missions look very much about judging operations against their own standards or what they set out to do, and that tend to be very operational. But we wanted to understand, what are the larger strategic value that these operations bring, and that result in these operations being regarded by some as valuable and by others or not, and by looking at that in more detail, what can that tell us? So that was more the overarching question that we wanted to achieve. At the same time, as you will hear from the 3 studies, we have actual real-life researchers that are doing this research, and each of them have their own interest, each of them have their own background, each of them come from a particular history that have brought them up to this moment where they are now leading or otherwise participating in this research studies. And that adds value in its own way to these studies. So we know that there's no way that this broad shared methodology that we've come up with can be executed perfectly in each case as if we are somehow, automates that do this research. Obviously we're not. So you'll hear that there's each of these studies also have its own special, unique features. And this was another thing that we thought was important. Although we are undertaking a number of operations under the umbrella of United Nations peace operations, and although we are also looking at other operations that the African Union undertakes, we hope in future to also look at European Union operations or OSCE operations or other types of operations. Although they can all be broadly under this umbrella of peace operations, each mission is of course very unique. And when we look at the effectiveness of operation, we need to understand and judge it in its own particular context. And also, we realize that the question about whether a particular mission has been effective or not, let's take the mission in the Congo that is the mission that Alexandra led the team on. Asking that question today, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, would each produce its own answer as well. So even a particular mission, we can't just judge, generally. We need to look at it in its particular moment in time. And so we hope also with this study to go back 2 missions after 3 or longer year. We don't know exactly what the time period would be. It would depend on so many factors. But the idea that you can't judge the effectiveness of a mission only once, but that if a mission continues for many years, that this kind of study is repeated over time. And that will also enable us to do longitudinal studies of the same missions over time, looking at different factors. Anyway, I think that's enough from me in terms of a kind of a general introduction to the network and how we undertook this research. What we're going to do now is to ask each of the colleagues to introduce their research studies on the Congo, on Somalia, and on Mali. And then, as Annika mentioned, we will go into smaller groups where you can really engage with those researchers in terms of questions that you may have. And then we'll come back again in the plenary also, where we can look at more cross-cutting issues or issues that you may have wanted to ask about another mission, although you ended up in the group on one particular mission. I've spoken a lot now, so let me just, before we move to the specific studies, is there anybody who have a question at this moment in time or a comment that you would like to make at this moment in time? Yes. Please.
Good afternoon. I'm Johannes Schors. I'm working opposite the road for GSurf, but soon moving on to Mali. I have one thing in you're hitting the right nails in terms of efficiency and how difficult it would be to define this in this context. However, in this 8 dimensions, is there anywhere the cost factor included?
No, we haven't looked at efficiency, in terms of mission against cost. I mean, we may have, and I see if the colleagues may have touched on that in their particular studies, but we haven't highlighted as a dimension to say. I should mention also, so we have here Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, SIPRI, Training for Peace, International Peace Institute, but we also have other partners, I think, in the room that may be here. DCAF, so colleagues here from DCAF, and anybody else who may be part of the network that's not in front here? Okay, not yet. Okay. Can I hand back to you, Annika, then to...
Wonderful. Well, I'm just going to hand over to Alexandra, I think. Just go straight to it.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Alexandra Novosseloff. I work in particular in IPI as a non-resident fellow. So I think going straight into the DRC case, I'll say first that before talking about the effectiveness of peacekeeping operations, I think we have to consider to change the lenses through which we look at UN peacekeeping and assess the impact of the various missions. Peacekeeping operations are basically deployed with pocket money in the places nobody cares about and where the P5 have no strategic interest. I'm being a bit blunt, but I think it's needed if we want to look at effectiveness in a proper manner, in a realistic way. So under such circumstances, we can say that most missions have accomplished a lot and are helping the so-called international community to keep an eye on those situations and to keep the conflict at the level that is acceptable. Not too much violence and not too many deaths. So if we look at MONUSCO, we can say that it has achieved comparatively with comparatively little resources for an area of operation that is the size of a continent. It has accomplished quite an impressive mandate. And at the end, a peacekeeping mission is trying to do its best to implement often unrealistic or over-ambitious mandates. And this is also part of the job that we have to do, is to do some kind of a reality check on, you know, the mandates that are created by the Council. So successes and failures of a peacekeeping operations are conditioned by political conditions around the adoption of the resolutions. So what are the dynamics in the Council? The interpretation of the mandate, the degree of support the mission enjoys, interpretations and misperceptions of what it can or should accomplish, means given to it, and ambitions assigned to the mission. So with this in mind, I'll try to look at three things. First, the strategic and operational achievements. Second, strategic and operational constraints, and factors of effectiveness. So the first strategic achievement of MONUSCO, I think, and what we found out after going to the field, is its contribution towards the reunification of the country. When MONUC was created, people needed a visa to travel to the east of the country. The country was completely divided. And one interlocutor told us, well, if the mission had not existed, most probably DRC would have not existed in its current form. Second strategic achievement, of course, the 2006 general elections that enabled the country to have legitimate institutions. And of course, these elections did not bring stabilization, especially in the East, but at least you had some rather functioning institutions that were then that the president of that country did not respect and move towards another direction. Another strategic achievement is, and then I'll be very cautious on saying that, it's a certain stability and a certain level of protection of civilians in the East. I think POC is the hardest of all objectives to measure, because how do you measure security or insecurity when in parts of the country that the mission is not deployed, and when the mission has left some of the spots where it was, then there's no data that allows us to say that stability has been back or not. So it's very, very difficult to to measure. But overall, I think we can say that MONUSCO, by its mere presence, has brought a certain level of stability, in particular in the East. And also we have to remember that at the beginning the mission was deployed on the entire country, and then it was focused on the East, and then now it's there's a bit in the Kasai, and but so that's, you know, it has varied a lot. I think at a more operational level, I think there's also what MONUSCO brought over the years is the development of a certain civic activism, more balanced debates during electoral periods, in particular through the action of its Radio Okapi, which I think has been key in stabilizing a bit the debates in the country. I mean, at least that's what people have told us. Another aspect that we often don't see is a lot of people that we met were saying, well, you know, MONUSCO is always there when to count the bodies and to count, you know, what's to come after the massacres. And it's true, of course, but over the years, nevertheless, the mission has been critical in terms of the observation, in terms of fact reporting, information collection, all elements that were used by the ICC to prosecute Jean-Pierre Bemba, Thomas Lubanga, Germain Katanga, Bosco Ntaganda. So we can't say that the mission was useless in that. So now moving to the strategic and operational constraints. First, of course, you have one of the biggest constraints has been over the years the consent of the host nation. And that consent has been diminishing over the years. And many interlocutors we met were saying that now basically MONUSCO is working with a government that doesn't want it to be there anymore. So how do you factor in that that situation, and how do you then prepare for the next stage? That consent has been in particular problematic when it comes to a number of reforms, because as you know, a resolution of the council is a way to ask a country that has been in conflict to conduct a number of reform in order to achieve stability and rule of law. And there, in particular on police and army reform, the DRC, the Congolese government, blocked each and every step of the way. And that has impacted on all the other aspects of the mission, in protection of civilians, in overall stability. If a government has still an interest in making a part of his country unstable, then there's very little thing that the UN will be able to do. It seems to be obvious, but we have to keep repeating this because the Council that just doesn't want to listen. And so if the government doesn't want the UN to be there. So how do you engage with this government? How do you have a true dialogue with this government to move forward a number of things? Other strategic constraint is the fact that it's the political environment, the regional environment of that mission. Regional, first of all, you had until 2002, 2003 countries that were neighboring countries that were in the Congo, and then you had clearly some neighboring countries that had a stake in maintaining the insecurity in the East in particular. So if you can't bring them together and make them understand that how to make peace, then it's going to be very difficult. And I have to mention also that since 2002, 2003, and even after with when the elections of 2006 were held, this mission has been evolving without a proper political agreement, and that is very difficult because you can't give a real objective to a mission, and so they can't be, if you don't have any strategy, then the tendency is to go to a more militarized approach, and we know it's a dead end. This mission also never had a real patron in a way, or a real supporter in the Security Council. So nobody, it didn't have a champion. So nobody, no country that was able to leverage a commonly agreed blueprint in order to put an end to this conflict. So there again, it's very difficult for a mission to implement anything if the support from the council is just not there. What I found also very disturbing is this mission, but it's not this. It's not only Congo. All missions, if you ask each and everybody in the mission or outside, they have a different interpretation of the mandate. And so if you can't have one messaging, then what do you do? You can't act in a coherent way if everybody thinks that the mandate should be this or that. And still to this day there's debate, or there's interpretations that want MONUSCO to be proactive or less or more protective, and this is not, the mission cannot perform properly with that. And there's, of course, like in many missions, there's a lack of strategic communications, a lack of strategic communication strategy to really go after the misunderstandings, the sous-entendu of what the mission should do or should not do, and what are the means really given to this operation. When we went to the Congo, everybody remembered what the European Union operation did in 2003 in Ituri, the Operation Artemis, and everybody was saying, but why MONUSCO can't do the same thing? So there's a number of misunderstanding that undermines the effectiveness of peacekeeping operation. Maybe I should stop here, no? Because I've been very long, but
very interesting.
Do you want to end just with an overall summary of, in a nutshell, what would you say with findings and your recommendation?
Well, my recommendation is the first one. We have to change our lens. We can't expect from these missions to do everything that is written in the Security Council resolution, unfortunately, because the Council never puts enough means to achieve what it recommends or what it is asking for. So, but that's...
Wonderful, thank you, Alexandra. And before we hand over the word to our next presenter, just open if someone has one question or so. One question, one comment. Or we just steam right ahead. Here we are. Yes.
And maybe, I'm sorry. My name is Kevin from the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund. Just a question about who's consulted during this research program project. How, for example, like, did you speak with the Congolese military or the Minister of Defense or the Congolese police?
No, we were not received any authorization to speak to the government, so we didn't meet with officially with the government. We met with some MPs here and there, but not the government. Otherwise, we met extensively with the UN mission, looking at also people that had a long experience in the mission. The mission has been there for almost 20 years, so you have people there that have been there since 2003 or so. So and so we particularly wanted to talk to these people because they have a longer view on what, overall the impact of the mission has been. But we've also, and that's the case for all the studies, we've also conducted 2 focused groups around representatives of civil society, members of the civil society, of researchers, local NGOs, to have their impression on the work of MONUSCO.
Thank you very much. We'll continue in the working group, so hold on to that one and join the group, please. We'll move from DRC to Somalia, and Linda.
Thank you very much, Annika, and thank you for coming to this afternoon session. I'm going to present our findings on the African Union mission in Somalia. And perhaps to preempt your question, I would say that yes, we have gone through what Alexandra and her colleagues went through in Mali, but in our case, we did speak to some government officials because we received permission to do so. So we spoke to the National Security Advisor, for example, members of parliament, and some members of the security architecture in Somalia. So I think that before I go into the strategic achievements of the mission, it's important for us to go a little back into where AMISOM started from. Many of you may recall that the United Nations had actually sent 2 missions to Somalia earlier, ANSOM 1 and ANSOM 2. And the United Nations pulled out because there was no peace to keep in Somalia. So then, 12 years after the United Nations left in 2007, the African Union decided that it could not watch on while Somalia disintegrated. And so it put together a mission and got approval from the United Nations Security Council to deploy into Somalia. Now, the starting point is particularly important because at the time of AMISOM's deployment, the security situation that the United Nations could not address 12 years earlier had deteriorated even further. So when the first troops arrived in Somalia, there was certainly no peace to keep, and instead, as their aircrafts were landing, there were bullets. So these soldiers entered Somalia essentially fighting. And this is what it was for the last 10 years. It is also particularly important for us to note that perhaps what we need to interrogate, especially in the case of Somalia, is whether or not the first 10 years of AMISOM was a peace support operation properly so called, or whether it was a counter-terrorism operation. And I don't think that is specific to Somalia. I think it's also specific. We can say the same thing about Mali to an extent. So having said that, I will then go on to look at the strategic achievements of the mission. And here I'm looking at the strategic achievements along the lines of what is stipulated in the mandate, the current mandate. And so there are three main things that are stipulated in the current mandate, which is that AMISOM should work to reduce the threat posed by Al-Shabaab and other armed opposition groups in Somalia. It should work to provide security to enable Somalia's political process and efforts at reconciliation. And the third is to enable the transition of security responsibilities from AMISOM to Somalia forces. So I'm going to look at the strategic achievements along these three main lines. Now, reducing the threat posed by Al-Shabaab and other armed opposition groups. Somalia would not be Somalia today without AMISOM. And this has come from the government, civil society organizations, the United Nations, and other international actors in Somalia. The fact that today there is an international presence in Somalia is because of AMISOM. And the day AMISOM withdraws, if the Somali government and the Somali state is not able to fill that security vacuum, the international presence will disappear. So AMISOM has made considerable progress in reducing the threat posed by Al-Shabaab to the extent where Al-Shabaab no longer poses an existential threat to the government of Somalia. It doesn't mean that Al-Shabaab has been degraded. It doesn't mean that there are no attacks in Somalia. But what we do know is that the government of Somalia for many, many years had to operate from Nairobi, Kenya. Today, there is a government in Somalia, and the chances that Al-Shabaab will be able to run this government out of Somalia is very, very slim, if not non-existent at all. So on that score, I think that, or we think that AMISOM has done well to reduce the threat posed by Al-Shabaab and other armed opposition groups. There's a functioning government in Somalia, but beyond the government is that there is a certain level of normalcy. If you go to Mogadishu, people go to restaurants, people go to cafes. This would not have been possible 11, 10, 9, 8 years ago. So the fact that there is some normalcy, businesses are returning, the diaspora, the Somali diaspora is returning home to invest. That is a sign that the threat posed by Al-Shabaab is no longer existential to the Somali state. And that I think is a clear indication that the threat posed by Al-Shabaab and other armed opposition groups has been reduced. Of course, a lot still remains to be done to stabilize the country, to ensure that the threat posed by Al-Shabaab is effectively degraded. But I will come to that later. A lot of this rests with the government itself and other international actors. The second strategic achievement, or what was required in the mandate, was for AMISOM to provide security to enable Somalia's political process and efforts at reconciliation. Somalia has held 2 presidential and parliamentary elections. And you need to have a functioning government to be able to begin a political process in any country. And so the fact that the government has been able to move from Kenya back to Somalia, there has been 2 elections. We can discuss the merits or demerits of the electoral process, but that is not the job of AMISOM. So the fact that these elections have taken place by themselves through the security and the support provided by AMISOM is an indication that AMISOM is providing the needed security for the political process and efforts at reconciliation to begin. AMISOM provides security for a number of regional conferences. As many of you here may be aware, Somalia is a federal state. They are experimenting with how to make this work. And so there have been a number of activities, not just in Mogadishu, but also in the regional states. And for all of the VIP escorts, AMISOM has been the entity that provides that. AMISOM also provide escorts for some humanitarian actors. There are areas, or there were areas where nobody would have been able to go to without military escorts. So for those humanitarian actors who do accept military escorts, AMISOM has been providing those kinds of escorts for them to be able to operate. Through its training, advisory, and mentoring roles, AMISOM has also helped to develop the capacities of the Somali military and police forces to provide security to the country. Again, you cannot have a political process in any country when the security situation is dire. And when AMISOM went into Somalia, the Somali security forces were down, essentially. Now they are trying to work with the government to rebuild the security sector. And here we're talking about the military as well as the police service. So through training, through mentoring, they're supporting the government to recruit. Recently, they've put in place, working also with the United Nations mission, a system of human resource management, biometric registration, and etc. for and with the government. So on that score, a lot has been done and is being done. But then, just as Alexandra said, we need to measure the threats faced by the country with the resources available for the mission to respond. And it is also equally important to bear in mind that the development of national capabilities for security is the responsibility of states and not necessarily peace operations. So AMISOM can support the government of Somalia, but putting in place that security infrastructure to aid the political process to go on is the responsibility of the Somali government and the rest of the international community. And so here the government of Somalia needs to address some of the major challenges militating against the development of an effective security architecture for Somalia. Al-Shabaab continues to attack mainly political figures and AMISOM, but also the civilian population. So what we've noticed through this research is that in the beginning, Al-Shabaab was attacking indiscriminately. Now, they are choosing their targets very carefully. They're learning from the mission, so they are also trying to win the hearts and minds of the population. So what we see now is targeted attacks, mainly at certain politicians, business people. Of course, once in a while, there are deliberate attacks against the civilian population, and also in the attacks against these political entities and against AMISOM, sometimes there are civilian casualties. But we do realize that right now, you don't have the indiscriminate attacks that used to take place in the past against the civilian populations. Now, the modus operandi has certainly changed, and so there is a need for requisite capabilities to be able to meet the changed nature in which Al-Shabaab is carrying out its attacks. And here AMISOM therefore needs to be tooled to be agile and responsive, because what we see is that even though the nature of attacks have changed, the tools with which to respond to the attacks have not changed to match this. And so you have Al-Shabaab no longer moving in big groups. They are coming now in smaller groups. They are quite nimble. They are able to attack and then just retreat. And to be able to respond to these attacks, you need your forces to also be as agile. You need to have helicopters. You need to be able to have surveillance mechanisms so that you are able to detect early enough in order to be able to respond. And these capabilities are missing in AMISOM to a very large extent. The third strategic responsibility assigned to AMISOM was to enable the transition of security responsibilities from AMISOM to Somali forces. I think I already touched a little bit on that, which is that AMISOM is working with the government in developing the security forces of Somalia. But it is important for us to bear in mind that transferring security responsibilities from AMISOM to the Somali forces requires some minimum conditions to be in place. Primarily among these is a professional security force that is cohesive, resourced, and operates under a well-defined and respected command and control structure. For a long time, these conditions were not in place in Somalia. And now, working with other international partners, especially the UN, AMISOM has supported the government of Somalia to recruit, train, and develop some infrastructure needed for building the security forces. In addition to the work that's being done by AMISOM, some bilateral partners have also provided training and equipment to the Somali security forces. In December 2017, AMISOM started its drawdown and withdrew 1,000 troops in line with its revised mandate. In the latter part of October this year, AMISOM handed over one of the strategic locations, the Mogadishu Stadium, back to the government of Somalia. Now, this is particularly important because the Mogadishu Stadium, Somalis, and I believe there are a few Somalis here, Somalis love their football. So being able to have the stadium back and being able to have activities at the stadium is a good sign of normalcy having returned to Mogadishu. The second thing is that the Mogadishu Stadium is very close to Villa Somalia, which is the seat of the presidency or the seat of government. And so the fact that Somali forces are able to take over and maintain that level of security is a good indication that they are able to, or they are gradually being able to take over the security responsibilities of the state. Efforts are now underway to secure two of the main supply routes, Lego and the Mogadishu-Baidoa route. Securing these routes are very important because, one, it will enhance economic activities, especially in Somalia, not just in Somalia, also outside of Somalia, but our focus is on Somalia, so especially in Somalia. It will also encourage Somalis to settle in the liberated areas and by that or through that as a multiplier effect, further enhance the security. Because as I mentioned earlier on, Al-Shabaab is no longer indiscriminately attacking civilians. So what it means is that if the Lego and Mogadishu-Baidoa routes are sufficiently secured to allow economic activities to take place, automatically or by default, people would start to move in those areas because opportunities would be created. Now, infrastructure will be built. If Al-Shabaab is not keen on attacking civilian populations or civilian populated areas, then we would realize that we are getting, as a multiplier effect, even more security in those areas. So that is particularly important. Now, as part of the efforts at handing over the security responsibilities, AMISOM is also supporting the re-establishment of government authority in Somalia through support of rule of law, justice processes to the relevant state government, but also the federal government. Now, this is particularly important because for a country that has been at war with itself for so long, a lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed. The human resource capabilities are low, and so it's important to ensure that you put all of these things in place to be able to have a functioning state, a state where conflicts are resolved through rule of law rather than through the barrel of the gun. One of the biggest challenges are recorded by the police, for example, are issues of murders where people get killed because there is a conflict and the police is not able to arrest the perpetrators. And when you have that in any society, it just spirals out of control. And so this is one of the things that AMISOM is trying to also do. Now, Somalia now has a transition plan, and AMISOM is trying to support the implementation of that transition plan. So most of the things that I've talked about are part of the phase 1 implementation of the Somali transition plan. Of course, there are a number of challenges, and now I will move on to... Okay, to the mission constraints. And the mission constraints in Somalia are not very different from what has been spoken about in Mali. One is the lack of adequate capabilities. There are very little surveillance. If Mali is complaining that it doesn't have, Congo is complaining that it doesn't have capabilities, it is worse in the case of Somalia because this is an African Union mission that is being supported by the United Nations. A lot of the capabilities required are actually maintained and controlled by the United Nations Support Office to the African Union mission. And so the logistics part of AMISOM is actually controlled by ANSOS. And that doesn't work well for those who are familiar with peace support operations. The commander needs to have his or her logistics with him or her, and this is not the case in Somalia. So that's a big challenge. Of course, there's the challenge of human resources, and here in particular, AMISOM has gotten to a phase where it is moving from the military focus to trying to re-establish state authority. So there is a need to have a lot more civilian presence. Now, there's a big challenge in AMISOM or in Somalia because there is a UN mission and there is the AU mission. The UN mission claims to have the political mandate, and the AU mission has the military mandate, which was never how this was supposed to be from the beginning. Now, the biggest challenge is that the United Nations, because of its security protocols, is unable to go into certain areas. So you've got United Nations civilian staff who are supposed to be helping with constitutional review, the re-establishment of rule of law, etc., but they cannot move out of their cantoned areas. The African Union personnel are able to move out of their cantoned areas. They've deployed into the state areas, but they are so very few. But now there seems to be a tug of war between the United Nations mission and the African Union mission. And I say this cautiously, but it appears to me that there is a quest to secure jobs, and this is at the expense of the Somali state. There is the lack of political will to implement the strategy, and this will have to come from the Somalis themselves, the Somali political elite. They've got what they need, they have a good plan. What is left is the political will to implement that good plan. And when the political process does not take off, the military support suffers. So this is one of the constraints of AMISOM. And then the final constraint is the international community. Somalia is almost becoming the site of proxy wars, especially among the Gulf states. So there is that challenge of neighboring states and their interests, but there is a bigger challenge of the Gulf states. So you've got a federal state. For example, let's take the United States of America, where there is a federal government that works with external actors to a large extent. What we see in Somalia right now is that there is the federal government, but a number of states, for their own strategic interests, are choosing to work with the state government and, in effect, undermining the authority of the federal government and the cohesiveness of the state. And if this is not addressed, all the gains that have been made so far can be eroded. So I think that going forward, we need to pay attention to these constraints. Thank you.
Linda, can you just also say a word about the team? Who was in the team that...
Oh, okay. So this team was led, the Somalia team was led by Professor Paul Williams of George Washington University. And then the participants, I participated, Michele from Italy, the University of Florence, so Turin, participated. There was Natasha Rupisinger from NUPI. There was retired Brigadier General James Mashakairi from Accord. And there was Amina Hilal, who came from the Cairo Center for Peacekeeping.
Thank you very much, Linda, and I think thank you for that rich presentation, and also I think we already identified some commonalities between the first two case studies. I will just, to be fair to this case study as well, if there's one question or one comment at this stage to put forward before we move on to the third case study. Anyone? Okay, then we'll move straight ahead, focusing on Mali. Jair.
Thank you very much. And I guess my time is up already, isn't it? Yeah, on the team, actually, I'm sitting here in between two team members, Fifi and Linda, and we also had Natasha on board, as well as a retired general from Bangladesh, Tobias van Gienland from CIF in Berlin, and Noura from CCCPA in Cairo. Talking about Mali, I think that, like what Alexandra described, we're talking about what I always call a band-aid solution to a deeper problem. that's a peace operation. Don't expect them to solve the problem. They're a band-aid and hopefully the start of a solution. If you think about the context in which MINUSMA was deployed in 2013, that was just after basically half of Mali had collapsed because of the result of advancing jihadists from the north who went all the way up to Mopti, which is a town in the center of the country. And at that stage, the region, ECOWAS, decided we have to step in, we have to stop this from happening before they move all the way up to Bamako. And the French also decided to step in, and that's when AFISMA, the precursor mission of MINUSMA, and Serval, the French operation, were deployed. And AFISMA, the African mission, was then replaced by the UN mission MINUSMA. So the context is basically you had extremists heading all the way up to half the country on the way to Bamako, the international community intervening, and then once the tide was turning, MINUSMA came in. And if you look at this, this graph, 2013 is the year that Serval, AFISMA are mainly intervening. This shows the number of fatalities in Mali. Then MINUSMA is deployed after they have been stopped, the extremists. You get a sort of more quiet period for a couple of years. There is a peace agreement signed for the north. And then what you see is in 2017, 2018, an increase in violence again. And strangely enough, a lot of that is taking place not in the north where the extremists originally came from. They wanted to be separate as well. It's a Tuareg rebellion in origin. But what happens in 2017, 2018 is that the violence actually goes south towards the center of the country, the Ségou-Mopti region. So if you look at this and you are looking at the effectiveness of MINUSMA, what you could say is, well, it worked for a couple of years, but they were not able to bring both sustainable peace in the north. After all, it is increasing again, the violence. And they were not able to stop the spread of violence to the center of the country. Now, why is it the case in the north? One of the reasons is the political process with regard to the north is very, very slow, to say the very least. This is either because there is no political will amongst the parties, or it's because they fear that they give away too much. So the best that MINUSMA can do is basically try to support the process. Well, it's not perfect at doing that, let's say. Interesting is that if you ask civil society in the north, what people often say is, well, actually we're not that unhappy with MINUSMA, but they base their judgment on the fact that MINUSMA is bringing them economic and development projects, not bringing them security necessarily. Whereas the Bamako-based pundits, primarily with Bambara background, will say, well, we don't like MINUSMA anymore operating in the north. First of all, because they are restraining our national sovereignty. Secondly, they are not confronting the terrorists, and that's what we wanted them to do. Then the second, looking at the effectiveness, let's say, of MINUSMA in the center. First of all, MINUSMA, until very recently, did not even have the mandate to touch the center. So can we really blame them for the things, went out of control? Not entirely. MINUSMA did try to deploy a quick reaction force last year. They started with it. It is only operational since June this year. But one of the problems in the center is that actually it's not part of the political process. So there are no real peace talks in the what is often called intercommunal conflicts in the center of the country. Besides, there are not enough military and civilian capabilities to really deal with that situation, because the country is already very big. If you want to have attention for the north, you have to think about your resources if you also want to do something about the center. Still, if you ask civil society actors from the center, they will often say, well, yeah, we don't like MINUSMA really, but the main reason is because they're not doing enough. We would like to have more. So you really have like three streams, those who think that the mission should leave, those who say, well, they're actually quite nice, but they're useful because of economic interest, basically. They're not necessarily bringing security. And you have those that really would like to see more, and it really depends on ethnic background, location, etc. Interestingly is that we very frequently ask the question, what if MINUSMA were not here? The counterfactual question. And quite often what you then get is, well, the mission actually prevented the country from falling apart, like DRC. If MINUSMA were not here, then the jihadists would come from the north and they would go all the way up to Bamako, and some even say, could even destabilize the whole region. It's a counterfactual, so you don't really know whether it's true, but still. Another thing that you could say is that MINUSMA has been, recently at least, relatively useful in de-escalating tensions during the electoral process. And another thing was that, that was the answer that we got in Gao in the north. Why is MINUSMA relatively useful? Their answer was, well, before MINUSMA, Gao was deserted because everyone had left Gao. They were either IDP or refugee. And if you look at this graph, this is the number of IDPs and refugees. It's just 1 month before the deployment of MINUSMA that the numbers are going down, but it continues to go down. And you could easily argue that in part that is because of the presence of MINUSMA. At least it facilitated the return. It gave enough security to people living in the region to feel that they could return. So that's mainly about the north. Then, so yeah, there is some impact. It's not that. It's definitely not what you would like it to do. You would like to see much more impact, but I think there is some. Then, looking at the strategic constraints, I think they're very similar to for example, MONUSCO. I actually, when I looked at the question, I first did my own answers and then compared it to MONUSCO, and I thought, that's interesting. There are three that are very similar. The first one in Mali, though, is slightly different. The Mali context is basically the only UN peacekeeping operation where you really have a lot of asymmetric threats due to the results of, let's say, jihadism, terrorism. I could give you figures on that. Number of fatalities in MINUSMA are relatively extremely high as well. There is a lot of insecurity also for the peacekeepers. And then looking at the broader environment, like in Congo, for example, a very difficult situation in terms of logistics, access to population, because the areas are gigantic and infrastructure is mostly absent, actually. Another one is strategic communication. If you look at support from the population for the mission, it's not always that strong, and that's in part because government officials have often said, have used the mission to blame, to avoid blame for their own failures. But it's also because often the population is not aware of what the mission is actually supposed to do. So the politicians in Bamako tell the population the mission should fight the terrorists, and they're not doing it. The mission is not really able to explain, well, that's not actually our task, we're supposed to stabilize. So what you see is that particularly in let's say the west and the south, the Bamako region, support is very low for the mission, whereas the more you get into the areas where MINUSMA is deployed, support is higher. Another one is the perceived impartiality of the mission, a challenge. The mission is there in support of the government in many cases, many things that it has to do. It has to support the government. And it also has to support the fight against terrorist organizations. And while on one hand, the government often feels that it's not doing enough, and for example, the mission is preventing the government from taking complete control of the north. Many people in the population would say, well, but you know what, this government is actually not necessarily a force for good. And maybe you shouldn't necessarily support the government. And maybe there are other solutions. Another challenge, the regional environment. As one person high in the mission, high up in the mission said, all neighboring countries are very much in favor of our mission, and they all support us. But they also see Mali as a place where they can get rid of their... Sorry. That is indeed a difference. So should I start again? So the other, where was I? Oh yeah, all countries in the region basically see Mali as a place where they all have problems with violent extremism, and they want to get rid of them, and they push it into Mali. So they also see it as a nice way out for themselves to stabilize their own country. The cost is a more destabilized Mali. But then, of course, you support MINUSMA to deal with those problems. And then the last challenge is operational splintering, I would call it. If you look at Mali, it's not only MINUSMA that is deployed there. You also have EUTM, a training mission from the EU training mission. You have EUCAP Sahel, which is supporting, which is an EU civilian mission. You have G5 Sahel, the joint force, which is supposed to fight terrorists. You have Barkhane, the French operation, which is also supposed to fight terrorists. And you have Ms Sahel, which is a civilian AU mission. Let's be honest, how, even if they are all coordinating and they're all complementary, there is little joint strategy. So then do I still have a little bit of time? 1 minute. I'll run through some factors. Political primacy, extremely difficult. After all, it's not moving forward in the north. Plus, a lot of the groups, armed groups, are actually not included in the process. National and local ownership. The government actually owns more than it is willing to admit. The political elite probably would not survive if MINUSMA would leave, but they love blaming the mission. Coherence and partnerships. We already talked about the many missions in the country. One person said, we do coordinate a lot, but we're basically all just islands. and internal coherence between the military and the civilian components. Yeah, well, you know, you have challenges over helicopters, etc. Also within the UN system, actually. They even fought over whether the military component was allowed to swim in the swimming pool in their camp. They were not able to solve that problem in Bamako. They had to bring it all the way up to New York. And lastly, the mission people-centered. Well, you know, that is already challenged if the mandate all the time says in support of the government, if the government is not always seen as a force for good. But also, if the security situation is that difficult, and it is that difficult terrain to actually go to the people, it's very difficult to have them actually lead the process. But the mission is trying. It has quick impact projects. It has trust funds and stabilization and recovery section that actually, I think, is not unsuccessful. After all, it is recognized for those achievements in the north. And that's the quick summary. And if you have anything to add, then...
Yeah, Fifi, do you...
Oh, I just wanted to touch on the women, peace and security aspects of the Malian mission. We realized that, I mean, they're doing well with respect to women representation within the mission. For instance, we found out that, I think it was in Timbuktu, for instance, which is a very harsh area, and one of the areas that heavily comes under attack, a contingent like Burkina Faso had about 40 women as part of their mission, whereas the Chinese had no woman, for instance, in that particular mission. So on the strategic level, within the mission itself, you realize that they are striving to achieve a balance with respect to having both men and women within the mission. But in terms of contingent support, there is a lot of work to be done on that particular aspect. And then also I wanted to touch on the issue to do with the regional environment and how that is contributing to the problems in Mali in terms of the constraint to the mission environment. I mean, if you're asking Mali, for instance, or the mission to deal with issues of violent extremism, you cannot do that without looking at how violent extremism is affecting, say, Burkina Faso, which is a neighboring country, or Mauritania, or Chad, or Algeria. I mean, you need to bring all these, you need to consider all these countries, these neighboring countries, as part of the strategy in dealing with, I forgot Niger, in terms of dealing with the issue in Mali. So that for me is very important. Then the issue to do with the political vision. For instance, Mali is a place where you realize that there are armed groups springing up almost every other month. And these are groups that have not signed any peace agreements. They are not bound by any peace agreements. And they are basically spoilers. And how do you deal with, and how does the mission itself deal with such a threat within the mission environment? I think that is one of the major issues that came out. And then lastly, one constraint with the mission is in terms of funding and how the mission is spending about 70 to 80% of its funds protecting itself, because this is a mission that is consistently under attack. You had to go through a lot of bankers and all to be able to see how dangerous the mission is. The mission overall is spending a lot protecting itself as against doing the work that is there to do. That's what I wanted to just add to.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much all panelists for this overview of the case studies that have been undertaken. A lot of research has gone into it, and the draft reports are fairly thick already, so there's lots more to discuss in the working groups, and a range of issues that have not yet been discussed. So we want to hear from you and your engagement in the working groups. Therefore, we suggest that we will. There will be 3 working groups. One group will stop here or stay here. Another one will go to the room next door, and then a third one is going to the room at the far end. And we warmly invite you to engage in more in-depth discussions on the findings as we move forward. So if I suggest that group number 1 with Alexandra on DRC will go to the room next door. And then we have Linda's group on Somalia stays here. And those that want to join the conversation on Mali goes to the group over there. We will have an intensive half-hour conversation on specific issues. I know, for instance, we're working on innovation together with the Graduate Institute, looking at, for instance, the implication, what's the impact of FIB, the intelligence capacity in Mali, and so on and so forth. Does that have an impact in the bigger scheme of things or not? I think many of us are suspicious to what extent that's the case, but I know that all of us are sitting with these type of issues, and please join us in the conversation and join the group. And we will come back here and see other further commonalities and follow up questions for the case studies that you're not engaging on. Thanks.
I just highlight on 2 or 3 issues that came out in our discussion. I think the very first one had to do with whether MINUSMA has an exit strategy. I think in the discussion and in the presentation, the issue about exits and the discussion about exit strategy didn't come in the discussion, but it was clearly highlighted that theoretically it looks like MINUSMA has an exit strategy, but then the realities on the ground is that it appears the mission is going to be there for a very long period of time. And so even though in the mandate they've clearly stipulated in terms of issues of stabilization, safety and security, training, and building the capacity of the Malian forces, and also helping to rebuild institutions as all part of the benchmarks for a possible exit. In real terms, that seems to be lacking. There was this other second issue that came up that had to do with the agility of the mission itself to be able to identify threats and to be able to deal with that particular threat. And that had to do with the issue about the center and how the mission itself didn't adjust, considering that the threat had moved from the northern part to the center of Mali. I mean, they had to take, for instance, New York and then, the local government to come to a common ground, because we know from our work that it appeared that the Malian state itself didn't want the mission to be in the center because for them, I think it would have been failure on their part and they would have lost credibility. And so for a very long time, they had prevented the mission from reaching the center. But then it came out clearly that perhaps we need to also explore how missions, for instance, could be quite agile and to be able to adapt to the situations and be able to deal with it. And then there was this other issue to do with the multiplicity of actors. No, before that, I think there was some strong issue to do with the measurement of effectiveness. It appeared that all our discussion seems to be driving towards the fact that the mission had not been effective in terms of dealing with some of these challenges. And so how do we measure issues of impact, for instance, vis-a-vis how this impact is translated to the local people, and then how the mission itself is able to deliver in terms of the indicators that has been set out in the mandate. I think that was one of the issues that came out. And then before you came to cut us, we're discussing we're discussing issues to do with the end state of the mission and also the IED capabilities of MINUSMA. We also talked about ECOWAS and how, in the scheme of things, it appeared that the regional approach to dealing with the Malian issue was sized by France, and how there are some challenges to do with J5 Sahel in terms of their operations and the likes. Yeah, basically. Yeah.
One small thing that I wanted to add, also to answer David's question or remark. Some in the group were saying, MINUSMA is militarized, whereas David said, well, to some extent you could actually say it's not militarized enough because, according to the mandate, they could actually deal with some of the bad guys planting the IEDs, but they're not even proactive in that. What I would say is I don't think that the mission is necessarily militarized itself, but it is tying itself up to a militarized approach in which the solution is training the FAMA, in which you have the G5 Sahel force, all looking for a militarized solution to a political problem. That would be my answer. The mission itself I don't think is necessarily militarized. Maybe bunkerized to some extent, but that's another thing.
Okay, thanks. We'll steam on with Linda.
Thank you. It was me and Cedric in that group, so I'm going to take a question that was asked but wasn't answered just when we were wrapped up, and then maybe Cedric can add a few things. So it was the whole issue of women in the AMISOM case, how women have been involved in addressing the challenges of Somalia. What we did find out was the fact that, first of all, women's strategic needs are being met when the strategic needs of the population are met. So that's one. But specifically, what we noticed was the fact that AMISOM has worked within the Somali structure to help with the promotion of women. So it's mainly a clan-based system, and when you look at the parliamentary elections, for example, the way that that was run, what you needed to do was to engage with the local systems to make sure that women were fielded along the clan lines. You couldn't go in there and try to change that structure, and so AMISOM worked with that. But when it comes to promoting women in the institutions, for example, the police force, AMISOM has been very innovative in saying to the state government, but also the federal government, we will train, let's say, 50 police officers. Out of these 50, 30% must be women. And when they have not found the 30% of women, what AMISOM then says is we will then downsize the number of people we are training because we need to have 30% of the trainees as women. So if you only brought us 10, then we are going to have to downsize how many we are training. And even though that sounds a little harsh, after the first round, it seems that has picked up. So somehow the women are being found to participate. And so I think this is something innovative, that we work with the structures and try to change from within, but also that sometimes you have to be very strict on what is required.
Thank you very much. And I think the other thing that was dominated probably most of our discussion when it came to AMISOM was about the regional dimension, the importance of the countries of the region in that operation versus a more kind of a traditional thinking in terms of UN peacekeeping operations where you have countries that are deployed as troop contributing countries who are from further away, that do not have a particular interest in the outcome. And I think we noticed that this is perhaps a larger trend underway in Africa, also with the multinational joint task force in the Lake Chad region and the G5 Sahel force, that there is, when it comes to especially to these kind of counter-terrorism related operations, that there's a strong emphasis on countries of the region forming some kind of a ad hoc coalition to respond to that crisis versus a more traditional approach to operations as international operations. Thank you.
She's got plenty. Alexandra.
Thank you. There were in our groups 2 questions that were raised, and that I forgot to mention before here. First of all, there was a question on why you have a multiplication of armed groups and how can you measure success when you have that trend. And I think it comes back to the issue of having a national, for the mission, for having a national partner. And what I try to highlight is that a UN mission works with a number of partners, and the first of those partners is the national partner. If the host nation doesn't is fueling those armed groups, we can't necessarily blame the UN on or ask the UN to have an impact on the the decrease of those armed groups, and I think that is something also we have to look at and change our lens. Is what is the national partner doing in order for the mission to accomplish its mission. And that leads to talk about, as for Mali, about the exit strategy. In DRC, a lot of people were saying that now the mission has stayed too long. It's in a way not the mandate. Those 20 years of the UN mission is not enough to change a country, but it's too long because it has enabled Congolese authorities to escape their responsibilities. And so when something is going bad in the country, it's easy to blame the UN and not look at what Congolese authorities did or did not do. And I think that is also something that we have to take into account. And now that the elections are coming up and a lot of people are saying, well, now it's time for the UN to leave, because it's an opportunity to leave, hopefully to leave in order, like in a good way, and not to just leave like a thief, but it's time for MONUSCO to really look at an exit strategy. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, and of course, having participated in that last group also, I thought it was a very thoughtful conversation, and a number of additional issues was raised in relation to strategic communications, and I think also the way, Alexandra, as you summed it up in there about, on the one hand, it's still not enough, but also at the same time, it's too much. And I think, as was also kind of the conclusion from that, was going back to what Alexandra has written about elsewhere, is the need for going back to basics. The mandates are too wide, too strong, or too large for the mission to be measured against. So we have a mission impossible that we've been trying to solve this afternoon. And I don't know if we want to, any questions coming back to the panels, or if you were not part of one of the case studies, and want to raise something, suggest something for one of the other studies, or something that we missed that you really, really, really want to draw attention to the wider group on. Adrian.
If it's recorded, I better be careful what I say. My name's Adrian Foster. I know Alexandra well. I was ended up as a force commander in the Congo after 4 years, and I've just finished in New York, where I was for 4 years as the deputy military advisor of peacekeeping. Maybe I'd just like to add 3 points to what has been said. One is on this political primacy. Certainly in my early days, I was fed the line that peacekeeping is ostensibly a political endeavour. And I fully buy into that as an idea. But I do feel at times that it's a bit of an empty vessel in terms of that statement. And if there might be a political idea at the start of a mission, that soon runs into the sand. And my observation would be that is why we then start to move into criticisms of the militarification of the mission and other aspects, because they're grappling at times with operational aspects, something to do, something that's near and appears a crisis, when in fact there's an absence of an overarching political strategy. And at times, I've just done some work on mutual accountability frameworks and compacts, and I really do feel that putting that back on the agenda and having a genuine compact with a host government, but holding that government to task as much as the international community, both the donors and the peacekeepers, in terms of delivery, I think is very important. Another one which it was mentioned that you're not covering finance, and I would just say that I can probably understand that, but I would urge you maybe just to put that on as an addition, because my experience is that it's refreshing in a way that in many cases it doesn't, my observation doesn't necessarily drive initial thinking, but it does come in. Financial interventions occur unexpectedly in missions where suddenly there's a need to find a saving because the council has suddenly decided that that's what it's to be. And so that can tend to lead to a sort of knee-jerk and disjointed strategies, plans, because suddenly something that was being planned, there's a need for significant cost savings, unexpected. So I would just advocate that maybe at some stage or other it might be interesting for you to consider that. The third one, and that is on strategic communications. It's one that's dear to my heart, but often as someone in the field, I've found that the ground realities are not necessarily accurately transmitted to capitals and indeed to the policy makers, and indeed even journalists and the media. And that can, so one can lead a double life in many ways as to what is happening. In my previous job, you can see things that are happening on the ground, but the conversation around the tables of policymakers can be something very different because they've latched onto a different story and not necessarily with respect the accurate story. And so it comes back to the accuracy of information, and we know how that's become very topical over the last 12 to 18 months. But I do think it's an interesting one about how in the future the UN in its operations manages to command or influence at least that space, so that what are the genuine issues are the ones that the policymakers are genuinely focusing on. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for the great afternoon. My name is Valentin. I work at DCAF next door. And I'm working on a project which aim is to improve security sector governance in the Sahel. And I wanted to come back on the notion of effectiveness. One thing that I wanted to ask is that we started the discussion with the idea that there were several levels of effectiveness. So we mentioned the limits of UN operations. We mentioned the costs. We mentioned the mandates and the gap between ambition and achievements. And so we are speaking about institutional limits. We mentioned the context, which is also another kind of limits and creates other problems. But my question was, are there functional limits at the missions level? like, can we say that the different division, different departments work together well between themselves? Are there issues related to intelligence? You know, that each UN mission has a joint monitoring analysis center. Maybe that's a question for you, sir, as well to raise. What is the use of information? Is it what about budgets? What about recruitments? And did you, through your research, work on all of those levels, any of those levels? I don't know, I spoke a lot, but I don't know if it's clear. I just wanted to mention the functional level at UN missions.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of more before.
There was one or two things. Since the gentleman is here, somebody raised yesterday and said the mission in Congo had costed 40 million? Billions in 19 years. So whether anybody knows if that figure is correct, I think it's highly inflated, but if it was the case, then it would be surprising that we have not achieved, with that kind of amount of money, almost, you know, we're now talking about. For whom? Billion, yeah.
Billion, okay, for 14 operations. It's 1 month of war in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
So what the international community is spending for UN, it's pocket money.
Yeah. That's why.
It's just not possible to say that peacekeeping is expensive.
Yeah.
Because, you know, when the international community is sending 130,000 soldiers in Afghanistan, it sends less than 10,000 in northern Mali, which is twice the size of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
It sends 20,000 in DRC, that is the size of continental Europe. So,
well, that's what I'm saying. So. Yeah. In any case, so we should put our money where when we are saying that is important, then we should. I'm not claiming to say that it is not enough, but I'm saying for that it's a continent you're talking about of DRC. So the international community at one point, many years ago, the first UN intervention under Dag Hammarskjöld was the only African country, Ethiopia, participating was in Congo. Decades later, we're practically at the same situation. So we might probably be better off if we handle our own affairs ourselves, because the end result, well, if you let us do, we will. The end result is probably not so bad. What reminds me is 1998, I was at the Bonn International Center for Conversion working there. The same questions were there. The same problem with the mandate, the same problem with financing, the same problem with equipment. So apparently we are at square one again.
We have 15 minutes left where we will solve all these problems. Exactly. We'll take one final and then we'll ask the panelists to comment on the questions. The future.
My name is Jack Lashendach. I'm an American student studying here in Switzerland, and I'm currently working on a capstone-like paper regarding UN peacekeeping and regional actors sort of as an involved partner. And my question is, a lot of you brought up the African Union, the European Union, specific member states of the UN's own individual actions. And I wanted to sort of press the issue a little further on to what degree you think it's detrimental to the success or the cohesion of a UN peacekeeping mission, and what you think could be done to include these partners in a more successful way. I can open that to pretty much anyone who can answer that. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So we will suggest we hand back to the panel and respond to the issues that relates to your issues, and also to have some final thoughts on the discussions today.
If nobody else is kicking off, I'll maybe try to respond to one or two issues. I think your last question is perhaps the most pressing one. You know, there's this sense that UN peacekeeping operations are not successful, that we are facing the same problems. The issues we've raised, the constraints we've raised, as you say, are exactly the same constraints that have been raised before. I think for me, my response to that would be that the constraints that you've mentioned are systemic issues that will never go away. We will never have enough money for peacekeeping operations. We will never have clear mandates. We will never have perfect training. These are realities of international operations. The international community will always, try to do the job with as little cost as possible. Having said that, does that mean, and this is the core question we want to answer with our research, does that mean that these peacekeeping operations have not been effective, despite those constraints? And I think what we are finding is that, of course, it depends on how you make the judgment, what your criteria is, but in its most basic form, these operations have prevented the situations from getting much worse. So if you take the Congo, the number of people that have died before the peace process and subsequently, they have prevented a number of people dying, the situation being more unstable than it is now. So there has been some successes or some impact that these missions have had. They do not reach maybe an ideal that we expect. But this is, I think, what we're trying to grapple with and trying to identify in our research. The interesting thing is, and we all, none of us like to think that negative peace is enough, but it seems that in this case, the most important factor for the international community, whether to decide whether a peace operation is being effective or not, is essentially the negative peace question. Right? Is the situation getting worse in terms of number of people dying, number of significant incidents, significant violence? That seems to be the most important factor and the most important contribution of these operations. But what we are realizing is that even when you talk about that as a negative peace factor and you mention securitized indicators like number of deaths, that at the end of the day, to achieve that degree of security or stability that these operations have contributed, a lot of that is political. It's not purely a military achievement. It's about getting a political alliance together to deploy an operation behind a specific motive. And we can see when operations have been the most successful, for instance, at particular moments, like the defeat of the M23 rebel group in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it is when a particular alignment of political will between the countries of the region, the international community, the host state, have been able to be achieved, and that is normally not able to maintain for a long time. But that political security, alignment of a political will behind a specific objective, that seems to have been when peace operations have been the most successful. The last thing I want to mention is that when we look at, for instance, the African Union mission in Somalia, or we look at the UN mission in Mali, we are only looking at one actor in a larger network or system of actors. We need to look at, what is the national and international actors doing together about the situation in the Sahel, or the situation in Mali, or the situation in AMISOM, or the situation in Somalia, and understand the role of an AMISOM or a MINUSMA in the larger context of many other actors that are contributing bits and pieces of that larger comprehensive approach. And I think that is something which our research network would like to go into more into the future, to perhaps not just try to understand the effectiveness of an AMISOM, which is very difficult to do in isolation, but rather look at the effectiveness of the international and Somali effort in achieving peace in Somalia. That larger combination of efforts is perhaps important to look at. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Yes, if I wanted to take the two of the questions. One is the I agree. The ground realities are almost never transmitted to capitals, or even from the UN mission to headquarters. And that has been one of the discussions we had in DRC. And something that we just talked in our group is people don't understand that the UN is unable to save some people 5 to 8 kilometers away from their base. But when you look at what the means they have and everything, the conditions, the weather conditions and everything, then you realize that yes, it's much more difficult than one can expect, and I think that also is part of explaining the realities of peacekeeping. Another reality, I agree, is the functional limits, and I've been convinced as I visit all these missions that there are certainly functional limits to what is achievable. In particular, the lack of integration. It's hard for civilians to understand military, and for military to understand civilians. It's this civil military culture is really hard to gain, and I think that's one of the limits. The other fundamental limits is the way the UN recruits people. I think a lot of people have been saying that this is failing missions, and I think, and that's why in my report in particular, I wanted to add a section on the way the mission is functioning internally, because I think this is key to the success or not of a mission. Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on the functional limits as well. This wasn't something that we looked at in the reports, but having listened to you and reflecting back, part of the challenges actually stems from the lack of a strategic direction. So form follows function, isn't it? And you need to have a broader vision, because security sector reform, that's what the UN and DCAF and others call it, the African Union calls it security sector governance, involves more than just the people engaged in the security sector. It involves your parliament, civil society, the communities, etc. But you need to have a strategic vision and direction to guide this. And often what we have seen is that in a place like Somalia, where you have various actors helping to train the various security forces and arming or equipping some of them. For instance, if you take those that the Americans have supported, they are better, they seem to be better trained, they seem to be better equipped, they seem to be better resourced, versus those who are trained by others, and that in itself creates a hierarchy you're beginning to create without necessarily having a strategic think through of it, an elite system within the security architecture, and that in itself is problematic in the immediate as well as in the long term. So I think that part of the challenge is not having a strategic policy or direction on those areas.
Okay, let me see. Let me start with the question on partnerships and whether they are detrimental, or having so many operations, whether that's detrimental or not. My take on that is not necessarily detrimental. I would actually say it's probably more affecting efficiency in many cases, but also not always. So in the case of Mali, I would say, if you have all islands that are not really working together in the same strategy, then things could have been more efficiently, and maybe some of those islands are not very effective. I'm not mentioning names there, but they sometimes are related to the EU. But I would say that sometimes it is actually very effective to outsource to a partner, because that partner is able to do things that, for example, the UN is not able to do. So it's not that clear cut. But I'm sure that Fifi will have a lot more on that. On financial policy discussions basically in New York and realities on the ground, I think it is an extremely big problem that there is not a good connection between, let's say, what happens in New York, extremely polarized, extremely politicized, and the reality on the ground. And I think part of the explanation of that is that those who deploy troops are not the same as those who pay for it, and that they're not the same as those who then decide on things. There's some overlap sometimes, but not generally. And what I think is that if this continues like this, it's going to affect the whole international system, the UN system. And you really have to work towards more common understanding, and that means that you have to pay together and you have to deploy together, at least more. So more Europeans, for example, deploying in missions, and finding ways of how those who deploy also contribute more financially. And then the last topic that I wanted to touch on was the efficiency question. It is an extremely difficult one, because then I think you should actually also have a look at, well, let's say, how efficient is ODA in comparison, development assistance. You have to look at the military budget in general. I mean, you know, yeah, what are we talking about in the bigger picture? It's peanuts indeed, it's pocket money. But you know, you should compare it to how much are we spending on development assistance, how effective is that? I remember there was one interview that we did with a senior military person in MINUSMA, who said, well, yeah, you know, because of MINUSMA, we managed to at least stabilize the situation, maintain the status quo, but we're doing that at the cost of 1 billion euros. And the question is that worth it? And I think that's sort of, you know, the answer that, or the question that you have to ask. I think it is actually worth it, though.
Just to add a little bit to the issue to do with the partnership in terms of the other actors, I think having multiplicity of actors in itself may not be bad. The issue arises when they are not able to coordinate and collaborate very well. And for me, I think moving forward, there should be some sort of operational guidance in terms of how they all operate within this, within any of these missions. And then there should be some sort of coordination and cooperation. And then one bit that I wanted to also highlight is trust among these various actors, because we realize from the Malian case, for instance, that when it comes to intelligence, some of them do not share intelligence, even though they are all operating in the same environment. And so there should be some level of trust among all this multiplicity of actors to be able to deliver the goals that is expected. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. We are just about on time, and of course anyone organizing a seminar knows that trying to organize without the break 2 hours and 45-minute session is suicide normally. But given the extremely rich and interesting research that has been done by our colleagues, I think we all kept the focus and engagement throughout this session. And of course, it then pains me to close this conversation, but at the same time, we know from Cedric's initial comments that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Not only will the work continue with this research, but in 3-4 years' time, there will be new visits to the same missions. And given, as Mr. Tito was saying yesterday, that we're living in tectonic times, changes, there will no doubt be not only turbulent times, as is the title for the Geneva Peace Week, but also even more changes. Only today we have the midterm elections, which we will all find out about when we go home later this evening, where in only a couple of years we moved from a budget, since we've been talking all about finances here now, from 8.7 billion for peacekeeping down to 6.7. So there's a major drawdown even before we know the outcome of the elections this time. So whatever seems to be coming out of the revisits by the case studies in 3 years' time, no doubt there will be changes. There will be also, unfortunately, probably continued problems, as was highlighted just now, but no doubt also changes. I don't want to be responsible for us being too late, so I will just thank again immensely all of our participants who so actively engaged on all these issues and in the working groups. Of course, the eminent speakers and researchers who's driving the work that led up to this meeting, and in particular NUPI and Cedric, who of course initiated this whole process and also decided to join effort with us for this Geneva Peace Week engagement. And so thank you for everyone, to everyone, and also time for a little break. But this is just the beginning of the future, because in half an hour there will be another session, the final session, where our colleagues from DCAF and the Small Arms Survey is doing the final push to strengthen peace operations today. So welcome back. Thank you.